it seems that one of the big points of contention doesn't seem to be when a woman transitions to man for male sports, because, and I don't know if this can necessarily be argued, that when you look at male sex versus female sex, there are developmental differences, which is why you mentioned some of those changes happening before puberty, or not letting someone hit puberty. And that's a discussion in and of itself.
For sure.
But, there have been people that have mentioned, okay, well, when we're looking at Pee Wee baseball or kids in elementary school competing, or even sometimes kids in high school competing, may not be a big deal. But we kind of touched on when it comes to college sports, potentially, you're not going to see guys on the basketball team, right, at the highest level of basketball in the NCAA, Division I or Division II, or even professional, worrying about a man or a woman transitioning into a man to take one of their spots. Right. Men generally aren't worried. The main group of people that are worried are female athletes, and primarily because there are physical differences, and we can probably talk more about that. But, and yeah, we've only seen a few instances with Leah Thomas, and
CC Telfer.
CC Telfer. But when you think of, like, for example, let's think of an athlete that is a high-level man at the time who has lifted weights, developed, transitioning into becoming a female. I can understand, and I can totally understand why women would not be happy with somebody taking their spot. And I know you guys were mentioning how, you see female athletes, female powerlifters becoming extremely strong because they see more numbers, and like you'll see them pushing themselves more with another athlete. But we're thinking now only within the context of the woman has to push herself to be as good as a guy or to get there. But
that's okay. So that you bring up a very good point.
Okay.
And it's a valid point. And here's a couple things with the arguments going on currently that skew everything.
Okay.
And you mentioned it right there at the end when you said to be as good as a guy. So number one, we have the assumption that a trans woman is no different than a guy throwing on a dress and then competing, right? So that's kind of what, like, people, when they're making the argument, that's what they're doing.
Good point. Yeah. I think a lot of people do think that.
Yeah, they do think that. And they think that, just, you're picturing, some jack dude, and actually somebody probably like me that is transitioning, as an athlete. But it's just, you throw on, some makeup, grow your hair out, wear some women's clothes, and they're picturing that same person with those same capabilities competing in women's sport. And that is not the case at all. Like we have talked about thus far, is taking away all the androgens, replacing them with estrogens has a huge impact on performance. Now, the question boils down to, right, how much impact? Does it balance everything out? Is that, if you have a high-level athlete as a male that transitions, are they going to have an unfair advantage? Or maybe they even aren't a high-level athlete. Like, so what the things that, and I'm the first, like I said, this is a complicated issue, and I'm the first person that will acknowledge that we don't have enough research. We don't really have the numbers to support an answer one way or the other. But I understand the arguments, and they're valid arguments. And
well, we could say logically that we would know that if Francis Ngannou was to fight against females,
he's going to destroy them.
Yeah, right. He's going to have a distinct advantage, right? Now, if it was a year from now and he was taking particular hormones, it might change things slightly, but we still need more time for it to have a bigger impact.
I think even that example, though, so this is
I'm
where
just throwing out a crazy example. Just for
we're talking
visual.
the extreme end of it, right?
But even I've heard people say, if LeBron James, this is different because these are people who have had all this time to develop their capabilities, and then in this alternate universe they choose to transition, and that
ain't gonna happen. Probably
it's not going to happen, and it doesn't necessarily make sense. You did mention something which a lot of people are they probably heard it and they're like, what the fuck? Is you mentioned before a child hits puberty and let's say that then they don't have all of that development. But that whole conversation in and of itself,
that's a whole another can of worms.
But that's where, as far as when it comes into the sports context, it could make some sense, because puberty and developing as a man and lifting weights, and let's just focus on this. Let's say that somebody transitions in their 20s or something, right? After puberty, you already mentioned, like, we don't know how much of a difference it would make, and if it would make enough difference for it to be fair for that individual to compete against women. And that's just tough. Like, we don't know, and we're just waiting to see more athletes.
Yeah, the research we do have, and the athletes we do have to look at, it does appear to be fair. The small number of studies we have and the small number of athletes that have been looked at, there was one particular study that was done on endurance athletes, middle distance runners. Now, what we saw was that, and I'm grabbing these numbers out of the air, so don't quote me on this part, but let's say that the women in general were 80th percentile of where, like, the top females were. It was like 80th percentile of where the males were at. And what we saw with those runners was that after a year on female hormones and the removal of androgens, that's an important part too, that has to be removed. Just taking estrogen by itself isn't enough.
Power Project family, how's it going? Now, we talk about sleep all the time on the podcast because it's one of the biggest things that helps you with your health and fitness, your recovery, your muscle gain, your fat loss, everything. That's why I've partnered with 8 Sleep for such a long time now, because the technology behind the mattress allows you to track your heart rate, the amount of times it takes you to fall asleep, your tosses and turns, your heart rate variability. It changes its temperature through the night based off how you sleep, but not only yourself, but maybe your partner on the other side of the bed. It is an amazing mattress. Andrew, how can they learn more?
Yes, head over to 8sleep.com/powerproject. That's 8 spelled out, EIGHT, sleep.com/powerproject. Along with more information, you guys will actually save $150 off of your entire order automatically. Links to them down in the description, as well as the podcast show notes.
That their performance fell. So, like, let's say they were 80th percentile as a male, they ended up 80th percentile as a female. I actually read an article a long time ago. It was funny. I was in an office to get an MRI for one of my powerlifting injuries and stumbled across an article in a runner's magazine about a runner who was a good male runner, wasn't like at top of the world, but thought it was transitioning and thought, I'm going to go in and crush all the women. And then it didn't happen. What happened was they found out they were just as good as a female as they were as a male. And this study backed that up. And what we largely saw was that for these middle distance runners, that their performance decreased accordingly. And that's some of the research that was used to base the ruling for the IOC and the NCAA. But it was a very small study. We don't have any good studies with strength athletes, with speed athletes, where males tend to enjoy larger advantages over their female counterparts. And so that's definitely, like I said, I'll be the first person to say we need more research and we need more studies. But the information we do have and the athletes that have competed, we have yet to see a single trans athlete like truly dominate. Now, Leah Thomas and CeCe Telfer are the closest. But let's look at CeCe Telfer. So CeCe Telfer won the 400-meter hurdles in Division II. If she was competing in Division I, she would have placed 7th. So she was still a long ways from being one of the best girls just in college, let alone the world, let alone an all-time great. Now, Leah is still competing. We don't know what's going to happen with that. I believe there's been some rule changes that are going to prevent her from competing at a professional level. I'm not sure if that's all still up in the air where we're at with that. But the interesting thing about these two, and this is what a lot of people point to, is that, like I said, like with myself or any other athletes we've seen that are transitioning, get on estrogen, their performance takes a sharp decrease. Leah and CeCe, their performances haven't done that, at least not to the level that other trans women have. Now, is this something are they a genetic anomalies? Are they someone where their performance just isn't going to be affected that much by hormones? Have they not been on the hormones long enough? Where are their hormone levels at? How high are their estrogen levels? Have their testosterone levels been sufficiently suppressed? I don't know any of these things. I don't know if they know. I don't know if anyone's been testing and monitoring their blood work. Has the NCAA looked at these athletes? So, I mean, as part of this, maybe their hormone levels weren't where they needed to be as an athlete. But maybe they are. Maybe they're anomalies. I don't have those answers. But that's something we don't know yet. But typically what we see is a substantial reduction in strength, muscle mass, speed, all of those things. So that's something we need to study and we need to know going forward. And but like I said, and part of the big problem is that this has become politicized, right? So it's a very heated topic.
People get mad.
People get really
I hope
mad.
that people are listening right now. I hope you're listening with an open mind and just trying to hear both sides of it, because we're not pretending to have any real answers for you.
And for me, even though I'm a trans athlete myself, and even though, like, obviously I support trans athletes, I'm somebody who looks for the truth, looks for the facts. Like now, if every person transitioning was going out and crushing it in every sport, and they were going out there and breaking world records, I'd be the first to say, "Hey, we need to take a look at this." And this is
people getting hurt, concussions, and so forth.
Yeah, things like that. But so far, at least, we haven't seen that. But the other thing we haven't seen a ton of is a lot of trans athletes competing openly. There's been rumors about trans athletes at the Olympic level for some time that some have competed. The rumors I've also heard is that none of them have been good enough to actually medal. But that there were rumors about some runners, and I don't want to narrow it down too much because I would never want to out anyone. But there's been some rumors about athletes that before were afraid to come out because of the backlash or possible violence and things like that.
Yeah.
I want to say, just interrupt for a moment and say that sports in general are just complicated. This whole issue, like aside, trying to make sports a level playing field is very complicated. We were talking briefly about like mountain biking, and you're like, a mountain bike can cost like $7,000 or $10,000. And that this point has been brought up in like Tour de France, where the bikes can be, X amount of money versus the other guy's bike who's new. Salary caps in football, one team having X amount of money to pay for their players. Long time for baseball, they didn't even have a salary cap, so the New York Yankees would just spend crazy amounts of money. Meanwhile, the Milwaukee Brewers would have like half the amount of money. So sports, it's always a facade. They are very rarely. I mean, where you grow up, your parent. I mean, like you just go down a list of things that's fair and not fair, and an even playing field, and you end up with.
You can make an argument to be made that sports are inherently unfair and will never be fair. And like, I mean, what makes
trying to make it as fair as possible with the rules that you have for the sport, right?
Yeah, and trying to balance it out so everyone can compete and everyone can enjoy those things and enjoy all the things you learn from sports. And, like camaraderie, teamwork, and hard work.
I beat you with this set of rules. You played by this set of rules. I played by this set of rules, and you were able to win. You know, that kind of thing.
But obviously, genetics are a huge part of that, right? There's a reason why what the average height in the NBA is. There's a reason why like sprinters have certain attributes. There's a reason why strength athletes, have certain. There's a reason why strongmen tend to come from, a lot of them from small. Like how many strongmen champions have we had from Iceland, a tiny little country with 400,000 people? But yet, several of them.
That's unfair advantage.
You're Icelandic banned, but yeah. So I mean, there are arguments that can be made that inherently sports are unfair, and there are sort of valid points to that. But I'm definitely someone who I want to see things as fair as possible, and if there does appear to be a significant unfair advantage, then I think that's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah,
I think we don't have. The data we need to really say that. The data we do have actually lends itself to saying it is fair, at least as far as we can tell. Like I said, CC and Leah Thomas are the lone exceptions.
Yeah.
I mean, and people point to people like, are both of you familiar with Fallon Fox? The
I've
MMA
heard
fighter?
the name.
So she was one of the early ones. Fallon was actually outed. She was fighting women's MMA. And this is the one, whenever you hear about, trans female fighter, breaks another woman's skull and like all these things. So Fallon Fox is the person they're talking about. Now there's some things with that. So Fallon was 5-1 as a pro. And which sounds pretty darn good, right? And then it got to the point where after she was outed, like she was threatened a lot. Most everyone refused to fight her, and it was a lot of problems, and she just ended up retiring. So people will point, well, she was 5-1 as a pro. She fractured this woman's skull, like all this stuff. She's out there just murdering women. If you dig a little deeper, like most things that have, a political nature to them, there's a lot of exaggerations and a lot of truths that have been stretched a long ways. Yeah. So I believe the combined record of the women that she beat was like 8-22. Two of these women had no victories whatsoever. And the big one, the skull fracture, was actually an orbital fracture of the bone that goes around the eye, which is a very common injury in MMA. Yeah. And she's not the only woman that has done that, where another woman has suffered it. That's happened multiple times in women's MMA. And I'm not saying this to say that there were no issues there and nothing ever needed to be addressed, but just that to say that this is a good example of how things get exaggerated. And something where, this is Fallon here. And to where things get blown out of proportion and it not looked at, not assessed fairly. And like I said, it make it sound like she split someone's head in half when it was an orbital fracture, which is one of the most common injuries in MMA.
Yeah.
Hey, baby. I'm joking. Guys, like, comment, subscribe, and head to the Power Project Discord, all right? I know you enjoyed the video. Speak to y'all soon.